In the shadows of medieval Europe, beneath the stone arches of cathedrals and the flickering light of monastery candles, a war was being waged for the souls of the damned. But this wasn't a battle between good and evil, as the church would have you believe. This was something far more complex, far more terrifying, and far more human than any sermon ever dared to acknowledge. What if I told you that the werewolves of legend didn't turn to darkness out of corruption, but out of desperation? What if their allegiance to Lucifer wasn't born from evil, but from abandonment? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most misunderstood betrayals, the story of how an entire species of cursed souls turned their backs on salvation and embraced damnation. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the church's own actions drove these creatures into the arms of the morning star himself. You'll discover the forgotten documents that reveal a conspiracy of abandonment spanning centuries. And you'll learn why this ancient pact between werewolf and devil still echoes through our darkest folklore today. But first, let me paint you a picture of medieval Europe that the history books won't show you. Picture a world where the church held absolute dominion over not just the living, but the dead, the cursed, and everything in between. This was an era when papal bulls could condemn entire bloodlines, when excommunication meant more than social exile, it meant eternal damnation. And in this world of absolute spiritual authority, there existed creatures caught between human and beast, between salvation and sin. These weren't the Hollywood werewolves you know. These were men and women cursed by forces beyond their control, transformed by ancient magic, divine punishment, or demonic influence. They retained their human souls, their capacity for good and evil, their desperate need for redemption. They were Christians, many of them. They attended Mass when they could, confessed their sins, begged for forgiveness. They were parishioners who happened to grow fangs under the full moon. Now, you'd think the church, in all its supposed mercy and compassion, would have extended a helping hand to these tormented souls. After all, wasn't Christ himself known for embracing the outcasts, the lepers, the possessed? Didn't the scriptures speak of healing the sick and casting out demons? But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The church didn't see werewolves as cursed humans in need of salvation. They saw them as abominations, as walking blasphemies against God's natural order. The transformation itself was considered evidence of demonic possession, or worse, willing participation in witchcraft. There was no distinction made between the innocent victim of a werewolf attack and the practitioner of dark magic who sought the curse deliberately. In the eyes of the church, the bite made them all equally damned. This wasn't just theological prejudice, though theology certainly played its part. This was politics, pure and simple. The medieval church was an institution obsessed with control, with maintaining its monopoly on the supernatural. Werewolves represented something the church couldn't explain, couldn't control, and couldn't profit from. They were living proof that divine authority wasn't absolute, that there were forces in the world that operated outside papal jurisdiction. So what did the church do? They declared war, not a war of salvation, but a war of extermination. Papal bulls were issued declaring werewolves to be agents of Satan by default. Holy orders were established specifically to hunt them down. The Inquisition added lycanthropy to its list of heresies, punishable by death. And perhaps most cruelly of all, the Church declared that werewolves, by virtue of their curse, were beyond the reach of divine grace. Think about that for a moment. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, cursed through no fault of your own with this terrible transformation. Maybe you were attacked by a beast in the forest. Maybe you were born under an unlucky star. Maybe your grandmother practiced the old ways and passed something down through your bloodline. Regardless of how it happened, you find yourself changing under the full moon, becoming something monstrous and violent. Despite your desperate attempts to resist, you turn to the only source of hope you know, the Church. You confess your condition to a priest, begging for help, for exorcism, for any ritual that might free you from this curse. And what do you receive? Not compassion, not aid, not even an attempt at healing. You receive condemnation. You are told that your very existence is an affront to God. You're branded as a heretic, a servant of Satan, beyond redemption. The priest doesn't offer to help you fight the curse. Instead, he reports you to the Inquisition. Within days, armed men are at your door, not to save you, but to burn you at the stake. This is the mercy of the medieval church toward the lycanthropic. Now here's where the story becomes truly fascinating and truly tragic. Because werewolves, despite their monstrous transformations, retain their human intelligence and their human need for community, for belonging, for spiritual guidance. When the church slammed its doors in their faces, when it declared them irredeemable monsters, it created a spiritual vacuum. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Enter Lucifer, not the cartoon devil with horns and a pitchfork, but the Lucifer of medieval demonology, the fallen angel, the morning star, the one who rebelled against divine authority and was cast out of heaven. In many ways, Lucifer and the werewolves shared a common experience. They had both been rejected by the divine order. They had both been declared irredeemable. They had both been cast into darkness, not entirely by their own choice. But here's the crucial difference. While the church offered only condemnation and death, Lucifer offered something else entirely. He offered acceptance. He offered purpose. He offered a place to belong in a world that had rejected them completely. This wasn't about evil tempting the innocent. This was about the abandoned finding refuge. With the abandoned, the first recorded pact between werewolves and Lucifer appears in a document known as the Malleus Lycanthropiae, a lesser-known companion to the more famous Malleus Maleficarum. Hidden in the Vatican's secret archives for centuries, this text describes a series of supernatural alliances formed in the 13th century between various cursed bloodlines and demonic powers. The werewolf pacts are particularly detailed, outlining not just the terms of the agreement, but the desperate circumstances that led to them. According to these documents, the first werewolf to formally pledge allegiance to Lucifer was a French nobleman named Guillaume de Montfort. Guillaume had been cursed after a hunting accident in the forests of Normandy around 1247. True to his Christian faith, he initially sought help from the church. He donated vast sums to monasteries, funded the construction of a cathedral, even went on pilgrimage to Rome seeking papal intervention. But Guillaume's curse was too obvious, too public. His transformations were witnessed by too many people. When word reached the Inquisition, they didn't see a faithful Christian struggling with a supernatural affliction. They saw a heretic who had made a deal with demons. Guillaume was declared excommunicate. His lands were seized by the church, and a price was placed on his head, facing death and damnation from the very institution he had served faithfully his entire life. Guillaume made a choice that would echo through centuries of werewolf history. In a ritual performed at midnight in the ruins of a pre-Christian stone circle, he formally renounced his allegiance to Christ and pledged his service to Lucifer instead. But this wasn't a typical demonic pact where a human sells their soul for worldly power. This was something entirely different. Guillaume wasn't seeking wealth or influence or magical abilities. He already had the curse, after all. What he was seeking was belonging. He was seeking a spiritual framework that would accept him as he was, rather than condemn him for what he couldn't control. And Lucifer, according to the documents, didn't demand Guillaume's soul as payment. Instead, he offered something the church had refused to provide: guidance on how to live with the curse, rather than simply die because of it. Lucifer taught Guillaume how to retain his human consciousness during transformation, how to direct his bestial rage towards specific targets, how to use his curse as a tool rather than be consumed by it. More importantly, Lucifer provided Guillaume with something every human being craves: purpose, instead of being a mindless beast or a condemned heretic. Guillaume became a soldier in a supernatural war. His targets weren't innocent villagers or random travelers. They were corrupt priests, abusive nobles, inquisitors who tortured the innocent. Guillaume became a weapon of divine justice, wielding the very curse the church had condemned him for against the church's own corruption. Word of Guillaume's transformation spread through the hidden networks of the cursed and the outcast. Other werewolves, facing similar rejection and persecution from the church, began seeking out this new path. They gathered in secret, in remote forests and abandoned ruins, performing rituals that would bind them not to Christ, who had abandoned them, but to Lucifer, who offered them purpose. These weren't evil ceremonies filled with sacrifices and blasphemy. Despite what church propaganda would later claim, these were desperate acts of spiritual survival. But the werewolves weren't turning to evil because they loved darkness. They were turning away from a church that had declared them evil, regardless of their actions or intentions. The pacts that emerged from these gatherings were remarkably consistent across different regions and time periods. The werewolves would pledge their service to Lucifer in his war against divine tyranny. In return, Lucifer would provide them with control over their curse, with targets worthy of their supernatural abilities, and most importantly, with acceptance into a community that valued them for what they were, rather than condemning them for what they couldn't help being. This is where the church's version of events and the reality, documented in these hidden texts, diverge completely. According to official church doctrine, werewolves served Satan because they were evil, because they had chosen darkness over light, because they were irredeemably corrupt. But the truth was far more tragic and far more damning to the church itself. Werewolves served Lucifer because the church had given them no other choice. They had been abandoned by the very institution that claimed to offer salvation to all. They had been condemned not for their actions, but for their nature. They had been hunted, not because they had done evil, but because they represented something the church couldn't control, and so they found refuge with the one being who understood rejection by divine authority. They found purpose serving the one power that stood in opposition to the system that had cast them out. They found family among others who had been similarly abandoned and condemned. The irony, of course, is that by rejecting the werewolves so completely, the church created its own worst nightmare. Instead of cursed Christians seeking redemption, they now faced organized supernatural soldiers actively working against church interests. Instead of isolated monsters causing random destruction, they confronted a coordinated network of lycanthropic agents carrying out targeted strikes against church corruption and authority. The werewolves hadn't chosen evil over good. They had chosen acceptance over rejection, purpose over condemnation, belonging over exile. The church had declared them servants of Satan, and so they became servants of Satan. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, written in blood and moonlight across the medieval European landscape. But this was only the beginning of a supernatural war that would rage for centuries, fought in shadows and secrecy, between an institution that claimed divine authority and creatures that had been denied divine mercy. The pacts were just the first move in a game that would reshape the very nature of good and evil in the medieval world. The consequences of these unholy alliances didn't take long to manifest. By the late 13th century, reports began flooding into Vatican archives of coordinated supernatural attacks across Europe. But these weren't random beast attacks or mindless rampages. These were calculated strikes against specific targets, carried out with an intelligence and precision that terrified church authorities. In Bavaria, a corrupt bishop who had been selling indulgences and pocketing the proceeds was found torn apart in his locked chambers. The only clue was a single wolf track pressed into the stone floor, impossibly deep, as if made by something far heavier than any natural wolf. In Spain, an inquisitor known for his particularly brutal torture methods was discovered in his private dungeon, his body positioned in the exact same twisted poses he had forced upon his victims. The church initially dismissed these as coincidences, random acts of demonic violence, but the pattern was undeniable. Every victim was a church official who had abused their power. Every attack occurred during the full moon, and every scene bore the same signature, evidence of supernatural strength combined with human intelligence and planning. What the church was witnessing was the birth of something unprecedented in supernatural warfare. For the first time in history, lycanthropes weren't acting as isolated monsters. They had become an organized force, a shadow army, operating under infernal command structure. Each pack answered to a regional commander, who in turn reported to higher demonic authorities. It was a military hierarchy that mirrored the church's own organization, but inverted its purpose completely. The werewolf pacts developed their own twisted version of Christian ritual and symbolism. They held midnight masses in ruined churches, with Lucifer as their dark priest. They created their own perverted sacraments, the sharing of raw flesh instead of bread, the drinking of fresh blood instead of wine. They developed prayer books written in a mixture of Latin and ancient Germanic runes, containing invocations to the morning star and curses against papal authority. But perhaps most disturbing to church authorities was how these werewolf cults began attracting human followers. Peasants who had been oppressed by corrupt clergy, nobles who had been cheated by greedy bishops, even some lower-ranking priests who had grown disgusted with church corruption. These humans couldn't transform into wolves, but they could serve the pacts in other ways, providing information about church movements, offering safe houses, helping to identify targets. The werewolves had become more than just monsters. They had become a symbol of rebellion against ecclesiastical tyranny. They represented the possibility of fighting back against a system that claimed divine authority while practicing very human corruption. And this symbolism was perhaps more dangerous to the church than any physical threat the lycanthropes posed. By the early 14th century, the situation had become so severe that Pope Clement V issued a secret bull, never made public, authorizing the creation of a special branch of the Inquisition, dedicated solely to combating supernatural threats. This organization, known internally as the Ordo Sancti Michaelis, or the Order of Saint Michael, was granted extraordinary powers. They could operate outside normal church hierarchy, requisition resources from any diocese, and use methods that would have been considered heretical if employed by ordinary clergy. The Order of Saint Michael developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to combat lycanthropic threats. They created silver bullets blessed by bishops, forged silver chains inscribed with prayers, and developed a network of informants among the rural population who could report unusual animal activity. Most significantly, they began studying werewolf behavior patterns, learning to predict when and where attacks might occur. But the werewolves adapted just as quickly. They began varying their transformation schedules, using lunar calculations to change on nights other than the full moon. They developed codes and signals that allowed pacts to communicate across vast distances. They learned to identify order agents and began targeting them specifically, turning the hunters into the hunted. What emerged was a supernatural Cold War, fought in the shadows of medieval Europe. Neither side could claim total victory, but both sides inflicted terrible casualties on the other. Villages caught between werewolf packs and church hunters were often destroyed completely, their populations slaughtered by one side or the other. The common people, already struggling with plague, famine, and constant warfare, now faced an additional threat that prowled the night. The werewolf Lucifer pacts also began evolving beyond their original scope. What had started as desperate pleas for acceptance and purpose became something darker and more complex. Some pacts began experimenting with demonic possession, allowing lesser demons to inhabit their human forms while they inhabited their wolf bodies simultaneously. This created hybrid entities that were neither fully human, fully wolf, nor fully demonic. Other pacts developed the ability to transform at will, breaking free from lunar constraints entirely. They could shift between forms multiple times in a single night, maintaining their human intelligence in wolf form and their supernatural strength in human form. These advanced lycanthropes became nearly impossible for the Order to track or combat effectively. The most terrifying development came in the form of the Lupus Rex, the Wolf Kings. These were werewolves who had proven themselves so valuable to Lucifer's cause that they were granted additional powers beyond normal lycanthropy. They could command lesser demons, control natural weather patterns, and most frighteningly, they could create new werewolves through ritual rather than just through bites. A Lupus Rex could perform a ceremony that would curse an entire bloodline, ensuring that the lycanthropic condition would pass down through generations. This meant that the werewolf population was no longer dependent on random attacks or chance encounters. They could deliberately expand their numbers, targeting specific families or communities for conversion. The Church's response to these developments was predictably extreme. Pope John XXIII, already known for his harsh stance against witchcraft, declared a formal crusade against all supernatural entities in 1326. This wasn't just a campaign against werewolves anymore. The Church began targeting anyone suspected of supernatural abilities: folk healers, astrologers, alchemists, even people who were simply too knowledgeable about herbal medicine. The Supernatural Crusade, as it came to be known in secret church documents, represented a new level of paranoia and violence. Entire regions were placed under martial law. Anyone could be accused of lycanthropy or demonic association based on the flimsiest evidence. The mere fact that someone lived alone in the forest, or knew too much about animal behavior, or had unusual colored eyes, could be enough to warrant investigation by the order of St. Michael. But this escalation only drove more people into the arms of the werewolf cults. The Church's indiscriminate violence against anyone suspected of supernatural involvement created a vast population of potential recruits for Lucifer's cause. People who might never have considered allying with demons found themselves facing death or torture at the hands of church authorities. Simply for being different or knowledgeable, the werewolves began offering protection to these persecuted individuals. They created safe havens in deep forests and mountain caves where anyone fleeing church persecution could find refuge. These sanctuaries became centers of anti-church activity, places where forbidden knowledge was preserved and passed down, where alternative spiritual practices were developed and refined. What had begun as a simple rejection of werewolves by the Church had evolved into a comprehensive alternative religious system. The lycanthrope cults offered everything the Church claimed to provide: community, spiritual guidance, protection from evil, and hope for the future. The only difference was that their definition of evil included the Church itself, and their hope for the future involved the complete overthrow of papal authority. The theological implications of this development were staggering. The werewolves had essentially created a mirror image of Christianity, with Lucifer as their savior figure who accepted the rejected and the cursed. They had their own scriptures, written by lycanthropic scholars who had once been trained in church seminaries. They had their own saints, werewolves who had died fighting church oppression. They had their own prophecies about a coming age when the cursed would inherit the earth and the corrupt clergy would face divine judgment. This wasn't just a supernatural rebellion anymore. This was a full-scale religious reformation happening entirely outside church awareness or control. And at its heart was a fundamental question that would haunt Christianity for centuries to come. If the Church rejected those who needed salvation most, could it truly claim to represent divine will? The answer, written in blood across the medieval landscape, was becoming increasingly clear. The werewolves hadn't chosen evil over good. They had chosen a different definition of good, one that included them rather than condemned them. And in making that choice, they had revealed the Church's greatest weakness: its inability to practice the mercy it preached. The theological revolution brewing in Europe's shadows reached its most dangerous phase when the werewolf cults began producing their own religious texts. These weren't crude scrawlings. or primitive rituals performed by uneducated peasants. Many of the lycanthropes creating this alternative theology had been educated in church seminaries before their transformation. They understood Latin, they knew scripture, and they possessed the intellectual tools necessary to construct a comprehensive challenge to Catholic doctrine. The most significant of these texts was the Evangelium Luporum, or the Gospel of Wolves, completed around 1340 by a former Benedictine monk named Brother Augustine, who had been cursed during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Augustine's transformation had occurred while he was traveling through the forests of Hungary. But when he returned to his monastery, seeking help, he was immediately branded as demon-possessed and sentenced to death. Escaping execution, Augustine spent the next decade traveling between werewolf communities, collecting their stories, their beliefs, and their interpretations of Christian scripture. What emerged from his work was a theological framework that turned traditional Christianity on its head, while maintaining many of its core spiritual principles. According to the Gospel of Wolves, Christ himself had been a kind of spiritual lycanthrope, transforming from divine to human form, just as werewolves transformed from human to beast. The crucifixion was reinterpreted not as a sacrifice for human sin, but as the ultimate example of institutional religious authority destroying what it couldn't understand or control. The Pharisees and Roman officials who condemned Christ were equated with the medieval church hierarchy that condemned werewolves. Lucifer, in this twisted theology, wasn't the enemy of Christ, but his truest disciple. He had been cast out of heaven not for rebellion against God, but for refusing to participate in a corrupt divine system that valued conformity over truth, authority over justice. The fallen angel became a figure of liberation, offering refuge to all those whom the established religious order had abandoned or condemned. This theological framework provided werewolves with something they had desperately needed: a spiritual justification for their condition that didn't require them to see themselves as monsters. They weren't cursed beings struggling with evil impulses. They were chosen vessels, blessed with the ability to see through the church's hypocrisy and empowered to fight against spiritual corruption. The Gospel of Wolves spread through lycanthrope communities with remarkable speed. Copies were handwritten in monastery scriptoriums that had been abandoned during plague outbreaks, then secreted away to hidden libraries in forest caves and mountain retreats. The text was translated into vernacular languages, making it accessible to werewolves who couldn't read Latin. Within 2 decades, virtually every werewolf pack in Europe possessed at least portions of Augustine's revolutionary theology. But the Gospel wasn't just a theological treatise. It was also a practical manual for supernatural warfare against church authority. Augustine had included detailed instructions for identifying corrupt clergy, for infiltrating church structures, for turning ecclesiastical hierarchy against itself. He provided guidance on which church officials were legitimate servants of divine will and which were merely power-hungry politicians wearing religious robes. Most dangerously, the Gospel of Wolves contained prophecies about the eventual overthrow of papal authority. Augustine predicted that the church's corruption would eventually become so complete, so obvious, that ordinary Christians would begin abandoning it in favor of alternative spiritual paths. He foresaw a great reformation, where the rejected and the cursed would lead humanity back to true divine worship, freed from institutional manipulation. These prophecies weren't just spiritual comfort for persecuted werewolves. They became operational doctrine for lycanthrope military planning. Werewolf strategists began organizing their attacks not just to punish individual corrupt officials, but to systematically undermine church authority and credibility. They targeted bishops during important religious ceremonies. They sabotaged papal tax collection. They spread rumors and evidence of clerical corruption throughout Christian communities. The werewolves had learned something crucial about institutional warfare. You don't destroy an organization by attacking its buildings or killing its leaders. You destroy it by undermining its legitimacy, by revealing the gap between its stated principles and its actual practices. Every corrupt priest they exposed, every hypocritical bishop they eliminated, every scandal they brought to light, weakened the church's moral authority more than any direct military assault could have. By 1350, the situation had become so critical that Pope Clement VI convened a secret council to address what Vatican documents referred to as the lycanthrope heresy. This wasn't a public theological debate or an open discussion of church policy. This was a closed-door strategy session attended only by the most trusted cardinals, the leadership of the Order of St. Michael, and select scholars who had studied werewolf theology. The conclusions reached by this secret council were both predictable and tragic. Rather than examining why the church's rejection of werewolves had driven them to Lucifer, rather than considering whether ecclesiastical policy toward the cursed needed reform, the council doubled down on condemnation. They declared that werewolves were inherently evil, that their theological writings were demonic lies designed to corrupt Christian faith, and that any Christian who showed sympathy for lycanthropes' suffering was themselves guilty of heresy. More significantly, the council authorized what amounted to a supernatural final solution. The Order of St. Michael was granted unlimited resources and absolute authority to eliminate not just werewolves, but anyone who aided them, sheltered them, or even acknowledged their humanity. This expanded mandate meant that entire communities could be destroyed if they were suspected of werewolf sympathy. The church also began developing new theological weapons against lycanthrope influence. They commissioned scholars to write detailed refutations of the Gospel of Wolves, though these responses were kept secret to avoid spreading werewolf ideas to ordinary Christians. They created new saints specifically associated with werewolf hunting, providing spiritual patrons for order agents. They developed specialized prayers and rituals designed to protect Christians from lycanthrope theological influence. But perhaps most insidiously, the church began rewriting its own history to erase any evidence that werewolves had ever sought church aid or acceptance. Official records were altered to suggest that lycanthropes had always been willing servants of Satan, that they had never attempted to remain within Christian community, that their rejection by the church was justified by their inherent evil nature. This historical revisionism served multiple purposes. It protected the church from having to acknowledge its role in driving werewolves to demonic alliance. It provided theological justification for the increasingly brutal methods being used against lycanthropes, and it created a narrative framework that would influence Christian attitudes toward werewolves for centuries to come. The werewolves, meanwhile, had anticipated this escalation. Their intelligence networks within church structure had provided advance warning of the secret council's decisions. When the renewed persecution began, lycanthrope communities were prepared. They had already moved their most valuable members to secure locations. They had established supply lines and communication systems that could function even under intense pressure. They had developed contingency plans for every level of church response. More importantly, they had spent decades building alliances with other groups that the church had marginalized or persecuted. Jewish communities, facing their own ecclesiastical oppression, provided werewolves with safe passage through certain territories. Islamic scholars in Spain shared knowledge about supernatural entities that proved useful in lycanthrope magical development. Even some Christian mystics, those who practiced forms of spirituality too unconventional for church approval, found common cause with werewolf communities. These alliances transformed the conflict from a simple church versus werewolf struggle into something far more complex and threatening to papal authority. The church now faced a coalition of supernatural and mundane forces, united by their shared experience of ecclesiastical rejection. This coalition didn't just oppose church policy toward werewolves. It challenged the entire structure of medieval Christendom. The lycanthropes had become the catalyst for a broader rebellion against religious authoritarianism. Their pacts with Lucifer had inspired other marginalized groups to question whether the church truly represented divine will or merely human ambition cloaked in religious rhetoric. The werewolf theological framework provided intellectual ammunition for anyone who had reason to doubt papal authority. By the time the Black Death began ravaging Europe in the mid-14th century, the supernatural Cold War between church and werewolves had evolved into something unprecedented in Christian history. It wasn't just a conflict between good and evil, as church propaganda claimed. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of divine justice, the meaning of salvation, and the proper relationship between spiritual authority and individual conscience. The plague itself became another battlefield in this theological war. Church authorities interpreted the pestilence as divine punishment for humanity's sins, including the sin of tolerating werewolf heresy. They organized processions and public penances designed to appease divine wrath. They burned suspected werewolves and their sympathizers, claiming these sacrifices would end the plague. The werewolves offered a different interpretation. They saw the plague as divine judgment against the church itself, proof that God was finally acting against ecclesiastical corruption. They pointed out that the disease struck corrupt clergy just as readily as ordinary Christians, that papal wealth and authority provided no protection against divine wrath. Some lycanthrope theologians even suggested that the plague was Lucifer's gift to humanity, a cleansing fire that would purify the world of church influence. Both interpretations found audiences among plague-stricken populations desperate for explanations and hope. Communities that had lost their priests to disease sometimes turned to werewolf pacts for spiritual guidance. Villages that blamed church corruption for divine punishment sometimes welcomed lycanthrope attacks on surviving clergy. The plague had created a spiritual vacuum that alternative theologies could fill. The most tragic irony of this entire supernatural war was becoming increasingly apparent. The church, in rejecting werewolves so completely, had created exactly the kind of organized supernatural opposition it had feared most. By declaring lycanthropes irredeemable, the church had ensured they would have no choice but to seek redemption elsewhere. By branding them as servants of Satan, the church had driven them to actually become servants of Satan. The werewolves hadn't chosen evil over good. They had chosen acceptance over rejection, purpose over condemnation, Hope over despair. The church had declared them monsters, and monsters they became. But they became monsters with a cause, with organization, with theological justification for their actions. They became the church's most dangerous enemy, precisely because the church had made them so. As Europe burned with plague and supernatural warfare, as communities chose between papal authority and lycanthrope liberation theology, as the medieval world order began its slow collapse, one truth emerged from the chaos. The church had created its own greatest threat through its inability to practice the mercy it preached. The werewolves pledged to Lucifer wasn't a betrayal of Christianity. It was Christianity's betrayal of them. The final chapter of this supernatural tragedy began to write itself in the blood-soaked years following the Black Death. As Europe emerged from the plague's devastation, both the church and the werewolf pacts found themselves facing a transformed world. The old certainties had crumbled along with the bodies piling in mass graves. Traditional authority structures lay in ruins. And in this chaos, the question of divine justice versus ecclesiastical power would reach its ultimate resolution. By 1400, something unprecedented was happening across the European countryside. Entire regions were falling under what Vatican documents termed lycanthrope spiritual authority. These weren't territories conquered by military force, but communities that had voluntarily embraced werewolf theology over church doctrine. Peasants who had watched corrupt priests flee during plague outbreaks, while werewolf packs remained to protect their villages. Nobles who had seen their wealth seized by church tax collectors, while lycanthrope communities shared resources freely. Merchants who had been cheated by ecclesiastical courts, while werewolf justice proved swift and fair. The Gospel of Wolves had evolved beyond theological treatise into practical governance manual. Werewolf communities developed their own legal systems based on lunar cycles and pack loyalty rather than papal decree. They created economic structures that prioritized communal survival over individual profit. They established educational networks that preserved classical knowledge while rejecting church censorship. They were building an alternative civilization in the shadows of the old one, but perhaps most significantly, they were solving the very problems the church claimed only divine grace could address. Lycanthrope communities experienced lower crime rates than church-governed territories. Their agricultural practices, based on supernatural understanding of natural cycles, produced better harvests. Their healing traditions, combining folk medicine with demonic knowledge, proved more effective than prayers and holy relics. They were demonstrating through practical results that rejection of church authority didn't lead to chaos and damnation. It led to prosperity and peace. The church's response was predictably desperate. Pope Martin V, elected to end the Western Schism in 1417, found himself facing a crisis that made competing papal claims seem trivial by comparison. The werewolf alternative was succeeding precisely where the church was failing most obviously. While ecclesiastical hierarchy grew more corrupt and disconnected from ordinary Christian needs, lycanthrope communities were providing exactly the kind of spiritual guidance and practical support that medieval people desperately required. Vatican records from this period reveal a level of panic rarely seen in papal correspondence. Secret reports describe entire dioceses where church attendance had dropped below 10%, not because people had abandoned faith, but because they had found more authentic spiritual community among werewolf congregations. Bishops wrote frantically about tax revenues disappearing as communities redirected their tithes to lycanthrope mutual aid societies. Cardinals complained that their theological authority was being undermined by former church scholars who had joined werewolf pacts and were using their ecclesiastical training to expose doctrinal inconsistencies and historical manipulations. The most damning reports came from the Order of St. Michael itself. Their hunters were finding it increasingly difficult to operate in territories where werewolves enjoyed popular support. Local populations would hide lycanthrope pack members, warn them of approaching church forces, and sometimes actively resist order operations. The supernatural war had become a popular revolution, with werewolves as its spiritual leaders and ordinary Christians as its foot soldiers. This shift in popular loyalty represented something the church had never faced before. A successful theological alternative that offered everything Christianity promised, but delivered it more effectively. The werewolf pacts with Lucifer had created communities that were more charitable, more just, more protective of the innocent, and more dedicated to fighting corruption than the church itself. The rejected had become the redeemers, and the redeemers had revealed themselves to be the true rejected ones. The final theological irony emerged in the writings of Marcus of Prague, a werewolf theologian who had once been destined for cardinal rank before his transformation in 1428. Marcus spent his remaining human years developing what became known as the doctrine of divine reversal, a systematic theology that explained why God had allowed the church to drive werewolves to Lucifer. According to Marcus, the entire supernatural conflict had been orchestrated by divine providence as a test of true Christian virtue. The church, claiming to represent God's will on earth, had been given the opportunity to demonstrate Christ-like mercy toward the cursed and the outcast. Their failure to do so, their choice to condemn rather than comfort, to persecute rather than protect, had revealed the corrupt nature of institutional Christianity. The werewolves' alliance with Lucifer in this framework wasn't rebellion against God, but obedience to divine justice. They had become instruments of God's judgment against ecclesiastical corruption, agents of divine wrath, disguised as demonic servants. Their success in creating more Christ-like communities than the church itself proved that true Christianity could exist outside papal authority, that divine grace could operate through channels the church had declared unholy. This theological framework provided the final piece of the werewolf revolution. They weren't just offering an alternative to church authority anymore. They were claiming to represent God's true will on earth, suggesting that their rejection by the church had been part of a divine plan to expose ecclesiastical corruption and establish authentic Christian community. The doctrine of divine reversal spread through lycanthrope communities like wildfire, providing theological justification for what many werewolves had already begun to suspect, that their transformation and their alliance with Lucifer hadn't damned them, but had actually brought them closer to divine truth than they had ever been as ordinary Christians. They had been chosen, not cursed. They had been blessed, not condemned. They had been saved, not lost. By 1450, the supernatural war between church and werewolves had effectively ended, not through military victory, but through theological evolution. The lycanthropes had transcended their original alliance with Lucifer. incorporating it into a broader spiritual framework that positioned them as divine agents working to restore authentic Christianity to a world corrupted by ecclesiastical politics. The church, meanwhile, had been forced into an impossible position. They couldn't acknowledge werewolf theological arguments without admitting their own failures. They couldn't defeat werewolf communities through military force because those communities enjoyed popular support and divine blessing in the form of practical success. They couldn't reform their own practices to compete with lycanthrope alternatives without essentially admitting that the werewolves had been right all along. So they did what corrupt institutions always do when faced with successful alternatives. They pretended those alternatives didn't exist. Official church history was rewritten to minimize the werewolf threat, to suggest that lycanthrope communities had been small, isolated, and ultimately unsuccessful. The theological challenges posed by the Gospel of Wolves and the doctrine of divine reversal were buried in Vatican archives, never to be publicly discussed or officially refuted. But the truth couldn't be buried as easily as the documents. Throughout the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, werewolf communities continued to thrive in remote areas, maintaining their alternative Christian practices, preserving their theological innovations, and passing down their understanding of divine justice to new generations. They had achieved something remarkable. They had created a form of Christianity that was more Christian than the church itself. The legacy of the werewolf Lucifer pacts extends far beyond medieval supernatural warfare. The theological questions raised by lycanthrope communities would eventually resurface during the Protestant Reformation, when reformers like Martin Luther would echo werewolf criticisms of church corruption and papal authority. The democratic governance structures developed by werewolf pacts would influence later political movements. The economic cooperation practiced in lycanthrope communities would inspire various forms of Christian socialism. Most importantly, the werewolves had demonstrated something that would haunt the church for centuries to come. That rejection by ecclesiastical authority didn't necessarily mean rejection by God. That those whom the church declared irredeemable might actually be closer to divine truth than their condemners. That the last might indeed be first, and the first might indeed be last. The great irony of the werewolf-Lucifer alliance is that it ultimately led not to damnation, but to a deeper understanding of divine mercy. The werewolves had been driven to embrace what the church called evil, only to discover that their embrace of the rejected and the cursed was more Christ-like than anything the church itself was practicing. They had followed Lucifer into rebellion, only to find that their rebellion brought them closer to God than their previous obedience had ever managed. In the end, the werewolves didn't pledge to Lucifer over the church because they chose evil over good. They made that pledge because the church had made it impossible for them to choose anything else. And in making that impossible choice, they discovered something profound, that divine grace operates outside institutional boundaries, that God's mercy extends even to those whom religious authorities declare beyond redemption, and that sometimes the path to salvation leads through the very darkness that organized religion most fears. The howl of the werewolf in medieval European forests wasn't just the cry of a beast transformed. It was the voice of the rejected calling out for justice, the sound of the abandoned finding their way home, the song of the damned discovering they had never been damned at all. They had simply been misunderstood by those who claimed to speak for the divine, but had forgotten how to listen to its voice. Their story stands as eternal warning and eternal hope. Warning to religious institutions that abandon those who need them most, and hope for all who find themselves rejected by the very communities that should embrace them. Sometimes, the greatest act of faith is turning away from those who claim to represent God in order to find God for yourself. Sometimes, the deepest loyalty to divine truth requires the courage to be branded a heretic. Sometimes, the path to heaven leads straight through hell. The werewolves knew this truth in their bones, felt it in their blood, lived it in their transformation from human to beast to something entirely new. They had been cast out of paradise, and in that casting out, they had discovered that paradise was never about the place at all. It was about the journey, about the community you build along the way, about the mercy you show to others who have been similarly cast out. In the end, that's why werewolves pledged to Lucifer over the church, not because they loved darkness, but because they had learned to see light in places the church declared dark. Not because they hated God, but because they had found God in the wilderness where the church said God could never be. Not because they chose damnation, but because they discovered that salvation comes in forms religious authorities never expect and rarely recognize. The moon rises, the transformation begins. The howl echoes through the centuries, carrying with it a message that no amount of church condemnation could ever silence. The rejected shall be redeemed, the lost shall be first, and divine mercy flows in channels that no human institution can ever fully control or contain. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history, where the monsters turned out to be the heroes, and the heroes revealed themselves to be the true monsters. If this exploration of werewolf theology and medieval church politics has fascinated you as much as it has us, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more tales from the dark corners of mythology, and ring that notification bell so you never miss another legendary story. The night is full of secrets, and we've only just begun to uncover them.